Everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I'm co-director of the Future Security Initiative, and we're here tonight for the last event of our fall speaker series. We're really thrilled to have our colleague Prof. Nyhan here, and we're co-sponsoring tonight with the School of Politics and Global Studies, and our colleague Fabian Neuner is going to introduce the speaker. We'll do the usual system with a presentation and then some questions. And we'll ask those interested in the audience to type their questions into the Zoom question box. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening. It's really a pleasure to share the evening with you. Briefly, the Future Security Initiative is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank, and we focus in a holistic manner on security issues. We have educational programs, outreach and public programs such as this one, a whole series of research initiatives. And again, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening. My name is Fabian Neuner. I'm an associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies at ASU, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Brendan Nyhan, who is the James O. Friedman Presidential Professor at Dartmouth College in the Department of Government there. Professor Nyhan's research focuses on misperceptions and misinformation, both in healthcare and politics more broadly. He's an elected member of the Academy of Sciences and has been both a Guggenheim and an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. His work has been published in many top journals, including Nature, Science, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the American Journal of Political Science. He is currently a co-director of Brightline Watch, which is a watchdog group that monitors the state of American democracy. And he's also partially in that role and partially more broadly a public commenter who speaks broadly in the media about politics, the media, and the state of American democracy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nyhan for what looks to be a fascinating talk.
Thanks so much, Fabian and Daniel. It's great to be with you. Hi, everyone. I appreciate you joining us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in a second, but what I'm hoping to do today is to share a kind of big picture viewpoint on what I think we've learned about misperceptions and misinformation over the last 10 to 15 years of research. This has been a focus of my own research during that time. And as the years have gone on, more and more people have started to investigate this question. And I think we've learned some very important things, many of which will challenge prevailing notions about the prevalence of misinformation, who encounters it, and what effects it has. So what I'm going to try to do today is to distill some of those key findings for you and share why I think they challenge some of the claims that you'll often hear when people talk about misperceptions and misinformation. So make sure I share the right slides here. Always important. Go. Sorry about that. There we go. All right. So, and what I'm going to be doing here today is sharing findings that are summarized in two review articles of mine if you'd like more information. The first was published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2020, and the second was published in Nature in 2024 with my co-authors Jerome Budak, David Rothschild, Emily Thorson, and Duncan Watt. So you can find a kind of more detailed exposition of the ideas that I'm describing in those articles. I recommend them to you. If for some reason you can't access them, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to share them with you. So what I want to start with is the importance of this question, why it's so critical to understand what misinformation is, and what effects it might have, and then the implications of those findings for what we can do about the problem. And as we think about this question, it's important to hold two different ideas in our minds at the same time. The first is it's absolutely true that there are very serious reasons for concern about misinformation and misperceptions. We lived through a pandemic where hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people died unnecessarily because of misinformation that deterred them from getting life-saving vaccines. We've also seen the most severe threat to American democracy since the Civil War, an unprecedented attempt to overturn the result of a presidential election based on misinformation. So I take these threats to public health and democracy very seriously. Misinformation plays a central role in them. At the same time, though, misinformation has become a kind of catch-all explanation for everything that is wrong with politics and society. And when we see this kind of rush to blame some cause, to attribute all the problems in society to it, we should be very nervous, especially when people are making sweeping claims with little or no data. These kinds of processes, as they unfold, have sometimes been described as moral panics. And I think we've had one when it comes to misinformation in the period since, especially the 2016 US presidential election. That's when my role in this debate shifted from being someone who was asking people to take misinformation more seriously as a social concern to often arguing that the claims being made about its effects, its prevalence, and what to do about it were often unfounded. So that's the kind of motivation for the findings I'm going to share with you today. To understand this question, of course, we have to define what we mean by misinformation and misperceptions. And to do that, we need to start with a little bit of history on social science and how we've thought about questions like these. Ever since people have thought about democracy, they've thought about the capacity for human beings to meaningfully participate as citizens. And in those debates, it's often a central question: how competent are citizens, including how much do they know about politics? And in the kind of classical social science of the mid 20th century, these questions were typically posed as binary ones. On the one hand, some people were knowledgeable about politics, and on the other hand, some people were seen as ignorant of them. That's a kind of pejorative term, but that was the way that people were described in the literature at that time. And those are really the only two possibilities. You would measure these via survey questions. You'd ask people trivia questions. Do they know this fact about politics or that fact about politics? And you would often bemoan the lack of knowledge that people had about politics. So the concern was people lacked knowledge about politics. And that was thought to be a problem because in the idealized model of the reasoning or deliberative citizen that has had a lot of influence, the ideal that people were supposed to follow was to reason from facts, evidence, information, knowledge to evaluations of candidates and policies, and in turn to form meaningful preferences over them. Now, we've learned in social science that is not an accurate description of how people typically form preferences, but it's nonetheless had a great deal of influence. Now, the thing that I want you to notice about that entire thumbnail description I just gave you is nowhere in there did it admit the idea that people might think they know something about politics, but actually being incorrect. And that only begins to be considered seriously in quantitative social science over the last 25 years. An important early piece is quoted here that argues that there are people who aren't uninformed, they're misinformed. They hold inaccurate beliefs confidently. And that's distinct from people who are uninformed, but recognize they lack the relevant information. I asked them, do you know who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is? And they know they do not know the answer to it. And that's distinct, I would argue, from saying to someone, do you know who the rightful winner of the 2020 presidential election is? And they say Donald Trump with confidence, right? That's the key distinction here between, versus someone who would say, I have no idea who the legitimate winner was. So the way I typically define these terms is to think about misinformation as some false or unsupported claim about the world, and to think of misperceptions as holding a belief in some false or unsupported claim. But how we operationalize these terms turns out to be quite tricky. And I'll just offer a couple of caveats to establish what I mean by this terminology before we move forward. So in the first article that my co-author Jason Reifler and I published on this, we define misperceptions as cases in which people's beliefs about factual matters are not supported by clear evidence and expert opinion, which we intentionally define to include both false and unsubstantiated beliefs about the world. There are many claims people make which are not strictly false, can't be shown to be strictly false. We lack the information to definitively disprove them. but they are unsupported and often they're unsupported by credible evidence and often contradicted by the best available evidence. And it's important to include that set because, again, the set of claims that are known to be strictly false with certainty is a much narrower one. Now, how do we go about making these sorts of determinations? The quoted article here at the bottom, gives you a flavor for how people often think about defining misinformation. When the beliefs that people express are contradicted by professional experts with a strong reputation for being immune to partisan influences. For instance, government statistics, academic consensus, they point here to economists, et cetera. Now, these are tricky issues because, of course, who the relevant expert is and how strong that consensus must be to deem something to be misinformation is often a difficult question. And we saw this, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic when experts would, in some cases, make statements about their conclusions based on the best available evidence, and then revise those as new data and information became available. So it's, I think, important to try to be careful in making these sorts of determinations. There's no single standard one can state and apply in a clear way, but we have to be thoughtful about drawing these sorts of conclusions and try to focus on cases where we think the expert consensus is strong and the evidence base is relatively settled. So I would say, for instance, that the evidence on climate change, and specifically anthropogenic climate change, in other words, caused by changes caused by human behaviors and activities, right, is now settled. The existence of anthropogenic climate change is now, I think, a matter of extensive scientific consensus. On the other hand, there's still an active debate over whether the potential role of a lab leak in the beginnings of the COVID-19 pandemic. I tend to lean against that claim. I don't think the evidence that's been shown is convincing, but there's sufficient debate among relevant experts and government agencies that I would be careful about describing that as a misperception. One last note on vocabulary: the term disinformation is not one you'll hear me using, and the reason is it suggests that people are knowingly creating or disseminating false information. And we very rarely know that to be the case. We very rarely have definitive proof that someone knows that a statement they are making is false. There are exceptions, of course. For instance, when people are discovered to be consciously creating or disseminating false information, but of course, those are very rare. So I'll be focusing on the term misinformation. Happy to talk more about that issue if it's useful. Two last tricky notes. The first is that when we ask people in surveys what they believe, you might worry that they are misrepresenting their views or that they're guessing and so forth. So there's some very tricky interpretation issues when you try to measure misperceptions. People have worried about so-called expressive responding. People don't really believe some claim, but they're endorsing it in a survey. The claims that they endorse in surveys change from over time, but that's true of all public opinion. They're trolling just to kind of, get some enjoyment out of seeming to agree with an outrageous claim and so forth. And there's very serious issues associated with each of these that I'm happy to talk about more. But what I would say is, in particular, some of the kind of strongest critiques of this field have been found to not undermine its scientific validity. The first is it seems that when it comes to high-profile misperceptions, people hold those in a relatively stable way, and they seem to sincerely believe them. In other words, they're not engaging in so-called expressive responding, where they're falsely claiming to believe in something. They seem to believe in sincerely. So the cited study here looked at people who expressed belief that Barack Obama was a Muslim. There's a very similar finding about people's beliefs that the 2020 election was stolen. It also appears to be the case that even when financial incentives are provided for accuracy, that people continue to express belief in these claims at relatively similar levels. In other words, when the accuracy incentives are strengthened by offering these financial incentives, people are not admitting they never believed it to begin with. They're mostly holding to the beliefs that they otherwise expressed. The last point I'll make, and this is really critical to everything I'm going to tell you going forward, is that it's very hard to study. It's been very hard to study these questions in the past because we had to ask people what information they received, where they got news and information, and so forth. And we know from years now, decades of studies, that people's self-reported media exposure is not accurately measured in surveys. An example here is the vast overstatement in surveys of how much people watch the nightly network news when we compare survey data to Nielsen data. That's the kind of ground truth of the television broadcasting industry. We found similar results looking at self-reports of consumption from partisan news outlets like the Huffington Post and Fox News, where we found actually the partisans who were aligned with those outlets overreported consumption of them relative to what we saw in digital behavior data. And that's why digital behavior data is going to be the foundation of most of what I'm going to show you going forward, because then we can objectively say exactly what information people were exposed to. And I'll explain this graphic a little bit later in the talk, but it's an example of the kind of data that we can now leverage to better understand these questions. Okay, so in the time I have left, I'm going to describe what I'm going to characterize as myths about misinformation, exposure, and belief. And I'm going to discuss 4 of them listed here. Again, just to flag, I really welcome your questions and comments in the chat. Please do leave them. We're going to leave lots of time for Q&A, and I'd really like to dig in on whatever you find most interesting. The first of the 4 myths is that most Americans are in online echo chambers. This is a claim that's become almost ubiquitous in the last 25 years. The second myth is that exposure to false news and extreme content of various types is widespread, that the average person is being exposed to lots and lots of potentially harmful content, whether it's false information, whether it's information from low quality sources, or whether it's extremist content of the sort that can sometimes thrive online. The concern is that average people are being exposed to that kind of content a lot. It's often being foisted on them, as the claims go, by algorithms. The third claim is a broader one, and that's about the effects of social media itself. There are often assertions of harms from social media, and I'm going to question the evidentiary basis for those claims. And then finally, the fourth myth is that fact checks usually backfire. Fact checking is one of the most prominent ways that people try to counter false information, including online, by providing correct information, debunking the false claim in question. This is one I'll tell you about my own role in, but at this point, the important takeaway is that it is a myth as well. So it turns out that when you actually look at the data and you look carefully at the research designs that have been tested, you come to these very different conclusions. First, that the kinds of highly slanted diets that echo chamber exponents typically describe are quite rare. Second, when you think about the kinds of false news and low quality sources, extremist content, et cetera, that people worry about, exposure to those types of content, it turns out to be quite rare and heavily concentrated among small groups of people with extreme preferences. If you're worried about the effects of social media, I can't prove it's not having the stated claims, but I can tell you that the sorts of evidence that has been marshaled on behalf of the claims about the harms from social media is often quite weak, and there's reasons to question it. So I think the causal evidence there is quite limited, and the demonstrable harms are overstated. Now, I'm focusing here on the political domain. I'm going to set aside the mental health questions. Happy to talk about those in the Q&A. Finally, when it comes to backfiring, it turns out that fact checks usually work. When people are given accurate information, they tend to update their factual beliefs in the direction of the information that's been provided. That happens across the political spectrum, even if the information you're encountering is contradictory, is uncongenial to your political predispositions. The problem, as I'll describe to you, is that those effects don't seem to last. And so that's the more subtle problem that I think we need to worry about more. Not backfire, but a lack of persistence. Okay, so those are the 4 myths I'm going to describe to you. I'm going to say a few words about each one of the myths, and then I'm going to show you some of the evidence against each one. But again, I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about each of them. So the first myth is that most Americans are in online echo chambers. This is a term that has become almost ubiquitous. There are endless articles online about the echo chambers that people are in and how we're all just getting information that confirms our pre-existing views. This was a fear that was popularized in part by Cass Sunstein in his book Republic.com and Eli Pariser in his book The Filter Bubble. But there's many permutations of it that have been offered over the years. It tends to evolve as people describe each new media technology or social media platform. So there's this, but the underlying core idea is that people are disproportionately encountering information that reinforces their views online. And in its strongest form, the idea is that we overwhelmingly consume information that reinforces our views. And so as people try to understand why Americans are so polarized, which is a confusing question to many people, they often appeal to their information diets. Well, the reason Americans are so polarized is because they have such slanted information diets. They're only consuming information seems to reinforce their preference. Is that really true? Is that really true? And it turns out the answer is no. The study that really changed my views on this was conducted by my co-author, Andy Guess. And what he did here was he looked at that digital behavior data I was describing to you earlier. So we don't have to trust what people tell us they watch. We can actually see the websites they visit. These are near representative samples of people who are providing informed consent to share the web sites that they visit in their browsing. I'm happy to talk more about the limitations of that. It's not without limitations, but this finding has actually been replicated in a number of samples. So I think it's pretty robust. So what he's doing here, I'm going to talk you through this figure and what I think it tells you. What Andy did was he combined this data on the websites people visit in their browsing history with data from a team of Facebook data scientists that estimated the slant of different news sites based on how often they were shared by people on the left versus the right. So basically, each news site is scaled from -1 to 1, where -1 is sites that are only shared by Democrats, and 1 is sites that are only shared by self-identified, I think I said Democrats, self-identified liberals and self-identified conservatives. So if you're in the middle, you're talking about sites that are equally shared by both, and the extremes only shared by one side. Okay, and the estimates at the news outlet level have quite high face validity. They capture, I think, real differences in the slant of different media outlets. So what Andy does is he takes all the websites you visit and he averages those slant scores, and that lets him see what do people's information diets look like when you average across all the different places they get their news and information. Is it overwhelmingly liberal, overwhelmingly conservative, or somewhere in the middle? And if you look at the panel on the left, you can see these are so-called density plots, just helping you see the kind of average, the slant of the average web page that Democrats, Republicans, and independents visit. You can see they're all centered near the middle of the distribution, whether you're an independent or a Democrat or Republican. The average website those folks visit is near the center. Does that mean they don't ever consume things that are on the left and the right? No. But in many cases, people aren't paying very close attention to politics at all. They're not encountering politically focused content that might be more slanted or extreme. In other cases, they're encountering some stuff on both sides and canceling out. Now you can see there are differences there. So even though there's this kind of peak in the distribution around the middle, you can see the Democrats have more folks with news diets slanted to the left. That's in the bottom row of that left panel. And you can see the Republicans have more folks who have news diets slanted to the right. But you can also see that those folks are a minority. They're a smaller share, even of those partisan groups. Now, what's going on that seems totally wrong? It doesn't correspond with people's intuition. Well, the reason the world seems so different from that is, of course, not everyone consumes the same amount of political news and information as others. In fact, there are people who consume huge amounts and many others who consume little or nothing. And it turns out that the people who consume a lot of political news tend to have much stronger preferences for attitude, consistent news and information. So what you can see in the right panel is what the traffic distribution looks like for Democrats and Republicans. And you can see there's a big chunk of the news and information that Democrats are getting that is from these websites that slant to the left, that doesn't have a corresponding that outstrips the corresponding Republicans. Many fewer Republicans have a news website slanted to the left as much as what we see there. Similarly, on the right, the Republicans in the sample are consuming a lot of heavily slanted websites to the right. These are the kind of Foxes and Breitbarts of the world in a way that has no corresponding equivalent among Democrats. Okay, so the average person doesn't have a very slanted news and information diet, but the news audience is much more tilted because of these people who consume a lot of information that's favorable to their side. Okay, so that gives you a kind of a starting point in thinking about how news and information consumption online works. There are people who consume a lot of tilted content, but they're actually a minority. That's a theme that's going to recur as we talk about the second myth, which is not about echo chambers as such. Remember, echo chambers are just about like whether this information corresponds to your predispositions or not. Now we're going to think not just about slant or polarization. We're going to think about the actual content. We're going to say this isn't just content that's slanted towards one side. This is content that's false or unsupported. It's being generated by unreliable sources, or it has extremist content that we might think is potentially harmful. Okay, and again, the concern as various panics have taken place is that these kinds of encounters with this kind of information are extremely widespread and potentially even having really important effects on our politics. Okay, so one of the most salient examples of this is after the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Donald Trump wins the White House. The country is very surprised. It was thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. It turns out there was a kind of systematic polling error. We can talk about the reasons for that in the Q&A if you're interested. But there was a search in the absence of a clear reason why Trump won and Hillary Clinton lost. There was a search for kind of a simple story. And one that people grabbed onto was false information online, especially these so-called untrustworthy websites, sometimes called fake news sites at the time, that had circulated widely in the period before the 2016 election. It happened that my co-authors and I were collecting digital behavior data, the sort we've been talking about at that time. And so what we did was we looked for this near representative sample of Americans, again, with this online laptop and desktop browsing data, how many of them were visiting sites that have been identified as untrustworthy by researchers and journalists. I'm happy to talk more about the methodology for that. How many of them encountered one of these sites and visited it, and in particular, what share of the new information from sites that produce content on hard news topics did it make up? Okay, so what you're going to see is first, we're thinking, did they encounter this kind of type of content at all? Second, how much of their news and information diet did it make up? And we're going to differentiate here between Clinton supporters and Trump supporters. Okay, because of course they're going to have different preferences for the slant of the untrustworthy news they encounter. And the concern was that people would, of course, consume more untrustworthy news that corresponds to their preference. And you can see if you look at the left panel first that relative to Trump supporters, Clinton supporters were more likely to have encountered an untrustworthy website with a pro-Clinton slant. Okay, so that's consistent with our expectations. This news and information is something that might be pleasing to them. They support Clinton, they don't support Trump, and this untrustworthy website is promoting pro-Clinton, anti-Trump content, so they're more likely to encounter it. Correspondingly, we see that Trump supporters are much more likely to have encountered one of these pro-Trump untrustworthy sites. In fact, more than half of them did in our data. Now, that's just the question that the left panel answered is just how often did this happen, where we're just saying, did they ever visit a single web page from this type of site or not? What we see in the right panel instead is the share of people's news and information diet those sites represented. And what you can see is for Clinton supporters, it was negligible, virtually zero. These really made up, they were kind of rounding error in the share of news and information that people were exposed to. So when you're thinking about the claim that there were effects on people's behavior in the 2016 election, it's pretty implausible that those very rare exposures had an effect. And what you can see is the only non-negligible share of exposure is for pro-Trump untrustworthy news sites. Even there, it's a relatively small percentage of the content that Trump supporters were exposed to, but it's not zero. Okay. But what I've told you is that there's these relatively small groups of people who consume a lot of content that's consistent with their predisposition. So what we're going to do is subdivide the public a little more finely. So what we do in both of these panels here is take all the Americans in our sample, and instead of dividing them into Clinton supporters and Trump supporters, which is what you saw in the last figure, we're going to instead divide them into deciles. So these are buckets of 10% of Americans from the 10% with the most liberal diets on average. On the left, that's going to be the 1 on the x-axis in these graphs, all the way to the 10% of Americans with the most conservative news diets on average. That's going to be the folks in labeled with the 10 on the right of these graphs. Okay, and what we're going to do is look at exposure to these untrustworthy sites and how it changes as we move from folks with the most liberal information diets to the most conservative. Okay. Again, on the left panel, we see just a percentage of folks who ever encountered this type of content. On the right, we see what share of their news and information it made up. What you can see in the left panel is consistent with what we saw before. As you move to the left, so these people with more liberal information diets, exposure to pro-Clinton websites goes up. So more and more people, as we move to the folks with the most liberal information diets, saw one of these websites at least once. Okay. That's also true as you move to the right for pro-Trump untrustworthy sites. But you can see there's this really big difference for the 9th and 10th deciles there in the upper right of the left panel. Those are the 20% of Americans with the most conservative news diets. On average, they were much more likely to see untrustworthy news sites of any type than anyone else in the data. They jump out even more when you move to the right panel. The right panel, again, is showing the share of people's news and information diet these sites made up. And you can see for 70% of Americans, as you move from left to right, the share made up by those sites is negligible. We start to see it distinguish itself from 0 for pro-Trump sites in the 8th decile, but it really only becomes appreciable for that 9th and 10th decile. So those 20% of Americans with the most conservative news diets were responsible for approximately 60% of all exposures to untrustworthy sites in our data. Now, that's really important because if you think exposure to these websites had an effect on the 2016 election, you have to tell a story about why those people who already had overwhelmingly conservative news diets were somehow behaving differently. Those are not likely to be swing voters who are much more likely to fall near the center of the distribution. You could tell a story about turnout. We have no evidence of that, although we investigated it in our data to the extent that we could. One other note along these lines, just to reassure you that what you're seeing from 2016 is not an anomaly. We looked here in a study, my co-authors and I, at exposure to alternative and extremist channels on YouTube. That's another kind of form of content that people have worried about its harmful effects. There was a concern about people falling down so-called rabbit holes and being radicalized. They were being recommended extreme content, and that turned them into people who had extreme viewpoints. I'm happy to talk more about the details in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'll really focus on the key finding, which is when we looked at who watched videos from channels that have been identified by experts and journalists as either these alternative channels that were at the borderline between the mainstream and the fringe, or these extremist channels that were clearly over the line, we saw it was a very small percentage of participants who were responsible for the vast majority of the consumption of those types of content. For instance, in the figure there, it's a little bit small, so I'm actually going to put my glasses on. 1.7% of users were responsible for 80% of the time spent viewing alternative channel videos. The percentage is even higher for extremist channels. It's more like 90%. So we're really talking about tiny groups of people responsible for most of the behavior of concern. It's not the average person is seeing those kinds of videos. It's a tiny percentage of folks. And in particular, we find in our data, these are people who already had very negative attitudes on race and gender. That's a story that's inconsistent with this rabbit hole idea and much more consistent with the idea that there's very small groups of people who've sought out this kind of potentially harmful content. One other reinforcing finding it turns out that most of these folks who are consuming this stuff subscribe to the channel in question or one like it. So that indicates a kind of affirmative embrace of this type of content rather than it being foisted upon people. There's more complications I can talk about in the Q&A. I'm happy to provide more detail. We saw very little evidence of people falling down rabbit holes. Our interpretation of the evidence is much more consistent with people seeking out this kind of content, and it's a very small minority. Does that mean that's not of concern? Of course not. Even a tiny percentage of people on YouTube is a huge number of people in the real world. So I don't want to minimize that. It's a different concern, though, and a different model of potential harms or threat than the kind of idea that the average person was being radicalized, where we should be thinking instead about these relatively small fringes who are potentially finding content that reinforces these predispositions they have, or potentially even moves them to action. Okay. There are similar findings across a number of different types of data. There's examples summarized there that I'll skip in the interest of time. The last 2 points I'll make very quickly are first that the claims that are made about the harms from social media often lack causal rigor. And the reason we should be skeptical about these sorts of claims is that it's very easy to fool ourselves by for two reasons. First, on social media is a kind of warped mirror of society. It's refracting what's happening in society. So any negative social trend will be reflected on social media. It's very easy to look at that and think of social media as the cause. The second problem is that the rise of social media coincides with various negative social trends. And when two trends are correlated in time, they can seem to, what can seem to be causing the other. But we have to be really careful about inferring causality from that temporal correlation, okay? So the kinds of claims that we hear that social media is responsible for polarization have not found evidence when we've been able to use stronger research design. So for instance, experiments that we've done where people are paid to not use social media or where we change elements of social media have had mixed or null effects for the most part. Not entirely, but for the most part, the findings are not consistent with the story that social media is making people more polarized, making them hate the other side more. There's one recent finding that just came out that suggests something like this. I'm happy to talk about it more, but in general, the evidence is not there. And there's reasons to be skeptical. The trends in polarization that we observe started long before social media even existed. The final point, because I've probably depressed you in certain ways, is that we shouldn't worry that the sky is falling when it comes to misinformation. There's the myth out there that fact checks usually backfire. In fact, and this is from my own first article in this area with this so-called backfire effect, where in our original study, we found a couple of instances where providing corrective information actually caused a group that was most predisposed to believe the claim in question to endorse it more. It turns out over hundreds and hundreds of subsequent studies that sort of reaction is vanishingly rare. It turns out instead people mostly update in the direction of the information they've been provided. The problem is those effects don't seem to last. And what I'm showing here are examples of that from studies that my co-authors and I did looking at misperceptions about COVID. So these are multi-wave surveys. In the wave in which people were provided with corrective information, their misperceptions about the COVID claims in question went down. That's what the decrease is that you observe. And as soon as those, but in subsequent waves, those differences disappear. So it's turned out to be very hard to create lasting change in misperceptions. That's really the frontier challenge for the field. So I will just wrap there and just say what the implications that I think you should take away from this are. First, that these are problems that are more concentrated on the fringe than we've appreciated. That's where the harms are like the exposure rates are the highest there, and that's where we should worry, I think, most about the harms. These broader claims about harms from social media, I think, are not established, and we shouldn't give up on fact checking. Now, the final caveat that I'll close on before I turn it over to Q&A is just to be very clear that the evidence base I've described to you is overwhelmingly concentrated in the US and to a lesser extent, Western Europe. There are many reasons to think that the kinds of findings I've described to you could vary in the developing world. Less stable democracies, countries with weaker education systems, lower levels of media literacy, et cetera. That's very much an open question there's a lot of new research happening in that area. There's a lot more to learn. So I don't want to suggest that the findings I've described necessarily apply outside of rich countries in the West. We don't know that yet, but I do think we've learned something important, and we should be updating our views when it comes to the US and Western Europe. So look forward to your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. That was really extraordinary and so full of thought-provoking information. It wasn't depressing at all. It was sort of just the opposite, in that what you're suggesting is that the darker claims about social media, how it's warping our society, how it's forcing people to echo chambers, that seems not to be backed up by empirical evidence. So I'm wondering if it's true, in fact, that it's not social media that's the problem, that may not provide the sort of answer we want in terms of the dominance of misinformation. There seem to be so many cases of misinformation that are so prevalent that even if you're helping us understand the misunderstanding of social media's role, does that just push us to another set of concerns, which is, so misinformation is widespread, and now we don't look at social media, we have to look for other sources. And I could think, for one quick, maybe to concretize all this, you mentioned briefly the positions on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. There's a lot of data that suggests that large numbers of Americans, although this varies over time, believe that that was a stolen election. Would you see that as a kind of misinformation, given the evidence that suggests that may not be true? And if so, even if it's not social media's fault, so to speak, what does that tell us about misinformation more broadly?
No, it's a great question, and I think that's a perfect example to consider, because I think what it draws our attention back to is the role of elites. So something political science has often emphasized is how much of a role political elites, in a broad sense, play in forming and shaping public opinion. And we see that when it comes to misinformation. If you think about the 2020 election and the claim that it was stolen, the overwhelming source, the most common source by far, is Donald Trump, right? By far. It's not close. It's not websites on the internet. It's not obscure social media accounts you've never heard of. It's the president of the United States. And he promoted that claim in every way he could. It was covered widely in the mainstream media. He communicated directly with his followers. He also communicated those claims, of course, through social media, and people amplified them there. But if you had to say what was the most important factor in people hearing the claim that the 2020 election was stolen, you would say Donald Trump's campaign against the legitimacy of the election was the critical factor. So then you have to think, what are the incentives for political elites, and how does our party system function? One thing I think that's really challenging about the way I've reframed the question is, when the problem is social media, in quotes, it feels like a fixable problem. When the problem is our party system and our whole political system and the incentives it creates for politicians, I think that's a more challenging thing. And that's part of the reason I think people have grabbed onto these stories about social media and misinformation, because it seems like a more tractable problem than trying to address the underlying problems in our politics, which I would point to as really the key factors.
But Brandon, I just want to mention there's like reinforcing mechanisms here in a way, right? Because on the one hand, we have traditional media amplifying extreme voices on social media. Those extreme voices on social media, probably also those that are more engaged in misinformation. And so what you have then is this amplification of extreme voices, which then enters into the mainstream. And how do you deal with that?
No, it's an excellent point. I think the direct role of social media is overrated. Its role in undermining gatekeeping mechanisms in political parties and in terms of what views get widespread attention is underrated. So if you were thinking about what's the kind of steelman case for social media's impact, that's precisely where I would look. Donald Trump and just the way the Republican Party has been transformed, the social media has played a key role in those within party dynamics when it comes to the primary in 2016 and everything that's unfolded since. Even though most of that stuff is not reaching most Americans. Average people have no idea what's happening in like the Fox News cinematic universe, right? But in that world, those dynamics can be quite powerful, and they undermine the kinds of traditional gatekeepers that kept people like Trump out of national politics and limited the reach of the kinds of crazy claims that now get widespread circulation.
But it also puts a finer point on something. So your research, for instance, is really interesting in untrustworthy websites. And so that's a sobering story in a way, where it's actually a positive story. But then if you think about, well, nowadays people don't have to go to untrustworthy websites to get the information that originate from untrustworthy websites because they see it just on broadcast TV. And so I think thinking through kind of not just that, understanding that people aren't directly seeking out misinformation potentially, but that misinformation can seep in from many other ways, packaged in ways that might not even be called misinformation anymore, I think is probably the next frontier.
Absolutely. And one thing that people are trying to do more of that I think um, folks in the audience may have noticed as we were going through is they've tried to look more at the content people are being exposed to instead of the sources of it. And they've tried to think about how to measure that across lots of different mediums, not just online browsing. Those are frontier issues that we're just starting to address. They're very difficult research problems, as you know, but um, I'm hopeful we'll know a lot more about the microdynamics of dissemination in the way you're describing, and also how these claims move and where people encounter them in a broader sense.
Brendan, I have a question. There's something sort of somewhat counterintuitive about these overall claims. And by that, I mean, before there was social media and maybe the internet more generally, but let's think of social media, it was pretty difficult to gain access to more fringe opinions. You had to go to a odd meeting or make a real effort to get a publication by a small group. You had to physically often be in a place or get physical possession of something, magazine or whatever. So doesn't it seem like it must be true that social media has significantly expanded the degree to which people can gain access to all sorts of, say, more fringe opinions, more misinformation? And similarly, doesn't it also increase the degree of legitimacy of those positions?
The second is harder to answer. I think the breakdown of traditional gatekeeping that I was describing earlier is a real phenomenon. And um, the first point you raised, it's absolutely true, right? In the 1950s, if you thought there were communist plots to fluoridate the water, you had to wait for your John Birch Society newsletter to come in the mail. And once a month, you'd open it and say, oh, the communists are up to things again. And that might be all you heard about it until the next time the newsletter came. But for the kind of person who thinks that there's a communist plot to fluoridate the water, a person with those sorts of predispositions now can seek out this kind of information and, of course, mainline it in great quantity. So I do think the ways in which social media facilitates this matching of supply and demand are really important. I just think that's happening on the fringe. That's the kind of key point that I want people to take away. The average person is not very interested in this kind of content. The median voter is not very interested in this kind of content. But there are people out there who are, and relatively small numbers of them can have really significant pernicious consequences. I think the mistake we've made is we've seen these numbers on social media that seem large, and we've extrapolated from that average people are doing this stuff. And it's easy to lose sight of just how massive these statistics are at the scale of social media platforms, where millions and millions and millions of posts are going through these systems every day. So we see something had 800,000 views or 2 million views or 4 million views, and we think it's some sort of mainstream thing. But these little fringes can actually power numbers like that quite easily, especially if they have stories that kind of break containment and get over to, the next 15 or 20% of the population. So I am concerned that we've misunderstood the problem, and we have to think more carefully about these folks in the fringe. Now, I don't want to minimize either part of it. So if you think about January 6th, you mentioned last thing, Daniel, you mentioned the 2020 election. Think about January 6th. There's two elements of that. First, Donald Trump, right? The elite who is at the core of the effort to undermine the 2020 election and to overturn its result. Second, a very small number of people who showed up, only a couple of thousand folks, but they were enough to potentially threaten the life of the vice president, the speaker of the House, and most of Congress, and to destabilize the electoral process in our country, right? Even those polls suggest tens of millions of Americans believe the election was stolen, but it was only that relatively small group. But the combination of those two things was enough for us to come close to the precipice. So that's an example of the kind of worry that I would think we should take most seriously.
Let's take some questions here from the audience. A few people have posted questions. We'll try to get to them. Keep posting them. From John Farrell, how do you see AI and bots influencing misinformation? How can we adjust to get the right information to the right people at the right time so they can make the right decisions?
Great question. I will offer the counterintuitive take that as of now, I worry that the fears and harms of the fears about the harms of AI are actually outstripping the evidence of damage that it has caused. So people in my field have been waiting for the kind of deep fake apocalypse that people keep worrying about, and it keeps not happening. There are very few documented examples of deep fakes or other kinds of AI misinformation having important political consequences. There are a handful of anecdotes out there, but I would say the hype vastly outstrips the number of documented cases where there have been really significant harms. Why is that bad? Of course, we should be on guard. The worry I have is that by telling people so often they can't trust what they see online, we undermine the legitimacy of the real information, which is overwhelmingly what people see. And in fact, there's evidence along these lines that when you give people media literacy trainings, it can help them better detect false information, but it also makes them more suspicious of true information. And that's potentially problematic because the overwhelming, the overwhelming majority of the content people encounter is true, is legitimate. So I worry about that area. Now, it's not to say that things couldn't get worse. AI is certainly going to make it easier to produce high quality misinformation content at scale. So that could have consequences down the road. But for now, I worry more about the hype than the actual effect.
Question. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, there's a related question in the chat, so I was going to just follow up with that because, so how much do foreign information manipulation and interference risks of state and non-state actors dumping big quantities of disinformation on the internet, which then AI might repeat? And I guess it's because the question is not just about having an AI video of a politician engaging in some kind of scandal. But we've seen a lot of AI slop, for instance, about certain ethnic minorities engaging in crime, right? And so then you could see a lot of people on TikTok just seeing video after video, and it just becomes part of. So a lot of it is about Roma pickpockets, for instance. At what extent is that generic content or generated content? And so how do we think about how that might influence not just views of politicians, but about whole types of people more broadly?
That one, the threat model seems plausible, especially in areas where that kind of content has been linked to violence. For instance, the kinds of killings and lynchings that have taken place in India as misinformation is circulated online. In many cases, it seems like the demand for those kinds of videos that provoke outrage and anger vastly exceeds the supply of content that's arousing enough for people to get outraged and angered. AI is going to, of course, make that easier. So I think one could worry, especially in situations like that. Again, though, I'll say I find foreign influence operations in this area underwhelming. If you look at the Russian influence operation in 2016, it was amateurish. A very large number of people had some content from the Russian effort pass by them on Facebook for milliseconds, but there's no convincing evidence it had any effect whatsoever. If anything, if you were trying to think about where the evidence is most credible, it's that they created a political issue that would divide Americans. I think the evidence of that is much stronger than any direct effects where, because you can post all the information you want online. The challenge is finding an audience. And many of the foreign influence operations have not been very successful at reaching people. There are exceptions, RTs, trying to reach people in different countries around the world, et cetera. But again, it's really important not just to look at the content side, but to see who's actually encountering the content and what sorts of predispositions they bring to bear when they consume it.
Question here from Michael Sachs. How does the Dunning-Kruger effect relate to issues and findings in your talk? And please explain what the effect is also.
Yes, my co-authors and I actually have a paper about this. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the idea that people who are less confident don't necessarily recognize the extent to which they are less confident. This is often overstated to mean that people who are the worst at things actually think they're the best. That's not actually what the studies have found. It's just that they tend to overstate their relative or absolute performance, these low performers. What does that mean in this context? Well, what my co-authors and I found is that when we asked people how good they were at spotting misinformation, the people did at the bottom did tend to be who are objectively the worst did tend to overrate their ability to spot it in kind of a similar way to people thinking that everyone thinks they're above average driver. Even these folks who are actually quite poor at detecting misinformation thought they were quite good at it. And what was worrisome was that overconfidence was associated with greater levels of exposure to untrustworthy websites. So even though we don't have causal evidence in the study I'm describing, the people who were encountering the false information were the most overconfident about their ability to detect. And you can see why that would be a concern if people, have, overconfident beliefs about their ability to determine when people are trying to fool them.
Question here from Eric Berg. I'll shorten it. Many fringe thoughts seem to enter the public dialogue on social media first, and then they may gain traction and move on to more traditional media. To what degree is that a key element of your research, and what does it mean for the broader issues?
It's a great point. I have not done a ton of work like this, but I will recommend Kate Starbird's work at the University of Washington. And she finds, for instance, it's often the case that when you're looking at the dissemination of false claims online, there's actually a first stage of this before it reaches the mainstream media, which is relatively small accounts. And then a claim is circulating, and then it gets amplified by one of the larger accounts. And then that's what, in turn, makes it take off to the larger network and often then be grabbed up by places like Fox News or whatever, which are often harvesting whatever types of content are generating engagement and virality online. So I do think social media is a kind of mechanism for the dissemination of these things. You could think of the ecosystem of providing false claims that elites could amplify as being kind of much more efficient. There's a kind of digital petri dish out there that people can reach into and pull out stimuli from and then distribute them to the rest of the world. So in that way, social media definitely does contribute, but note it's a kind of a different mechanism than what is typically described.
We're getting to the end of our event. I'm wondering if you might leave us with a few final thoughts, possibly related to the interesting information that fact-checking seems to really be a productive way, at least for a short period of time, in combating misinformation. But what can we take away about addressing this serious issue of misinformation?
Well, yeah, I'll say two things. The Zoom's going to cut me off. The first is don't give up on fact checking because it works. The second is we should be really careful about approaching these issues from an illiberal perspective. There are a lot of people who want to get rid of misinformation at all costs. I've shown you some reasons to question those sorts of claims, but I would also submit to you that a society without misinformation is not a free society. And so we need to think really carefully about these questions before we rush into policy changes that could have real harms. And that's why it's so important to understand these issues better. I'm worried about the Zoom turning off, so I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Thanks to Fabian Neuner for helping out, for the School of Politics and Global Studies for co-sponsoring, Tony Roth for making sure this whole event works, and to our guest, Brendan Nyhan. Thank you, and all have a good night.